and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 11. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of 3 contemporary novels that are heart-wrenching and absolutely excellent. They are Missing Pieces, Nobody's Wife, and I Wanted You to Know. Welcome, Laura Pearson.
Hello.
So, you have 3 books out, and the publication of Missing Pieces, this is your first book, was down to a publishing intern, I believe, Sam, at Agora Books, your publisher, who found it in the slush pile.
Yeah, it came after a number of years of rejections, and I'd given up on my first 2 novels pretty much, which were Missing Pieces and Nobody's Wife. And then a friend encouraged me to send Missing Pieces out to some smaller publishers, which I hadn't tried before. And so I sent them out to 2 smaller publishers, one of which was Agora. And I think I sent it, and then after about 3 months, which was the time frame they said they would get back to me in on their website, I gave them a kind of a really polite nudge and said, did you get my... Because they'd already asked to see the whole novel. And then I just said, did you get it? And at that point, Sam, the intern, said that she had read it and loved it, and she was just waiting for somebody else to read it. And so that was a nice surprise. And then maybe a couple of months after that, they actually asked me if I could go in and see them. And I was trying not to get my hopes up, but I knew that they knew I wasn't based in London. And so I thought, they're not going to ask me to come to London to see them just to tell me they don't want to publish it. So I had kind of high hopes, but I was trying not to get too excited because I just had such a long time of trying to make this happen. And yeah, I met with Sam and Kate, my editor, and they just said they loved it and they wanted to publish it and asked me if I had anything else. And we ended up signing a 3-book deal.
Fantastic. So that was all done at that same time?
Yeah. So Nobody's Wife, which we published second, was already written, and I sent that to them. And then I Wanted You to Know, I had a very, very rough first draft of that written, and so I sent all of it to them. And after a bit of back and forth, they came back and said they wanted to publish all 3. And then we've worked on all 3 of them. None of them went out kind of as they were. We did various levels of edits on them, but yeah, they wanted to take all 3, which was absolutely kind of beyond my wildest dreams, really.
It is, yeah. I haven't heard anything like that before. It's pretty awesome. And your stories are, you've got 3 difficult books. I know it requires a lot of attention and time to read your books, because it is so well written and so hard hitting. Were they difficult for you to write?
I think all books are difficult to write to a greater or lesser extent. And I don't think they were difficult for me to write in terms of how emotional they are. They are just the stories that came to me and that appeal to me. I like writing about people's extremes of emotion. It's just what makes sense to me to write about people's lives falling apart and things like that, because I think when people are happy, there isn't really much to say about that. Having said that, I am writing something now which is much lighter, and that's quite fun. But yeah, I mean, they were difficult, but like I say, I don't think the difficulty was because of the depth of emotion, really.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and it'd be interesting to see where this new book goes, definitely. So tell us about your book club.
I run a book club on Facebook, the Motherload Book Club. The Motherload is a parenting community on Facebook. It's just got to 90,000 members, which is incredible. I did some blogging for them, and I asked them, this was a couple of years ago, I asked them if I could start a book club as a kind of offshoot from the Motherload, because I knew that if I just started one myself, it would take a long time to build up. But I thought if I started one with their name, which was already established, that we might have some more success. And they said yes. So at the start of 2018, we started it off as this Facebook group, and we've got just over 7,000 members. We have a monthly read-along book that not everybody in the group reads by any stretch of the imagination, but we have an online discussion about that book. And then we also just have a lot of general chat about books. I do reviews, and we get authors on to read the beginnings of their books and things like that. So yeah, that's something that I started as a kind of hobby, naively thinking that it wouldn't take a huge amount of time. And now it does take a huge amount of my time, but I absolutely love doing it. So it kind of competes with writing for my time, but it's been an absolute joy to do though.
Yeah, I can imagine it takes a long time with that number of people. Is it open to new members if people want to join?
Yes, it's open to anybody, and the vast majority of our members are women, and I'd say the majority are mothers, but you don't have to be a mother and you don't have to be a woman. So yeah, it's open to anybody. Yeah, it's a very friendly place. We kind of have the same ethos as the Motherlode, which is to be kind, and we're very hot on making sure everybody's nice to each other. But yeah, it's a really nice place to hang out if you like books.
Listeners, I will include links to that book club for you in the episode description. We better get on to your books because there are 3 to talk about. Missing Pieces is your first publication, and
yes,
it's obviously the first one that I came into contact with, and I was sent it and I just loved it. And there's going to be some extra discussion on here because it is set in my home city, which I absolutely loved. The story itself is excellent. And then obviously I did have that personal connection to it. It is a very sad book. Can you tell us about your inspiration for it?
I can. I did an MA in creative writing back in 2004 at the University of Chichester. And I started a novel there, which I've never finished. But the character of Esme and her sister Phoebe from Missing Pieces were part of that novel. And then I abandoned that novel, wrote Nobody's Wife, and then I kind of came back to those characters, but the novel was completely different from the one I'd started on my MA. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that I don't really remember the very origins of these characters. I feel like they've always been with me in a way because it took such a long time from that having those characters all these years ago to actually getting the novel out. I just remember wanting to write something about somebody who'd lost their sister in childhood and felt responsible for it. I mean, the setup is that Phoebe, the family's 3-year-old daughter, has died, and the mother and the father and the sister Esme all feel like they have some responsibility for her death, but the reader doesn't know exactly what's happened until much later on in the novel. So I think I just wanted to play around with that idea of I'm very close to my sister, and the idea of what would happen if partway through your childhood you lost your playmate and only sibling, and what impact that would have on the rest of your childhood, but also on the rest of your life. Because, as you know, the novel deals with the immediate aftermath, but then it deals with many years down the line and how Esme and the rest of the family have kind of picked up the pieces of their lives after that tragedy.
That's very interesting to hear, because obviously when you're reading the book, before I read about Esme being the character that you'd kept, I suppose I thought the inspiration or the beginnings of the book would have been Linda and the parents.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But, I love how Esme has a voice as much as the rest of the family. And then, of course, Bea is there as well. And, with a child's death, you think of the parents mostly, because they're the people that you'll see it affect. And it does affect children as the siblings, and they won't always be able to vocalise it. So, yes, I loved the way that you had Esme as such an important part of it. Shall we have a reading?
Yes. Let's do that. So scattered throughout the novel, there are letters that Esme write to her sister that she's lost, Phoebe. So this is part of one of those letters. Dear Phoebe, you never had mum to yourself, not like I did in those years before you were born. But oh, how she loved you. Her whole body smiled when you were here, and the way she grieved for you was like nothing I've ever known. At your funeral, I couldn't look at her. I held her hand and Dad's, and I looked at the ground and pretended it was a game or a dream. A part of her never came home that afternoon. Secretly, quietly, she closed herself off to further hurt. You couldn't notice by looking at her that something was missing. She still looked whole. Only Dad and I knew. I wanted to fix her, to gather up the pieces and stitch them together until she was real again. I never asked her to forgive me. Never dared, in case she couldn't. Just before our first Christmas without you, there was a heavy snowfall overnight, and I woke up, looked out of my window, and saw everything covered in a thick white sheet. I was ready to let go of the sadness that morning, ready to play and laugh again. I ran to Mum and Dad's room. Dad had left for the shop already, and Mum was lying on her back ignoring B, who was softly crying in the Moses basket beside the bed. There was a cold cup of tea on the bedside table. I shook her, Phoebe. I shook her and begged her to get dressed and play, and she just looked at me with those blank eyes and waved me away. When I left the room, my eyes were brimming with tears. I didn't understand. If I was ready, why wasn't she? How long would we be locked in these never-ending days of sorrow? I asked Dad that evening. He was easier to approach. He took my small hand in his and led me into the lounge, away from Mum, out of earshot. Still, he spoke in a whisper. He told me Mum was very sad about Phoebe, that she needed lots of time. I wanted to ask how much time, but I sensed I shouldn't, so I just nodded and he told me I was a good girl. I wasn't. I was the worst girl. There have been times when I was so jealous of you that it was hard to speak. We were an isolated group, our little family. Dad's parents had retired to Spain, and Mum's mum was all those miles away in Lancashire, never visited and not forgiven for the loneliness of Mum's own childhood. No one else. And I'd got used to it being the three of us. Of course I had. Without knowing anything different, I'd got used to that abundance of attention and focus, that concentration of love. When they told me you were coming, I didn't know I'd feel jealousy like that. I was 3 years old, full of wonder and excitement at the prospect of a brand new person, a brother or a sister to spend my time with. I didn't know that you'd stay, that you'd change everything, that you'd come complete with your own personality and curiosity and will. In your first months, I adored and resented you in equal measure. Sometimes, when I woke in the morning, I'd make deals with myself, that if I got out of bed the minute that Mum called me, if I brushed my teeth for 3 full minutes like I was supposed to, if I got through breakfast without spilling anything on my clean shirt, if I managed all of that, you'd be gone. I wasn't clear about how, about where you'd go, or whether you would ever have existed at all. Usually I faltered and you remained, and I could never be sure whether you'd have kept up your end of the bargain if I'd kept up mine. By your first birthday, I understood that you were a permanent fixture, and then I went too far the other way, of course. I began to depend on you, to expect certain things of you, and never once considered that you'd be taken, that one day you just wouldn't be there, that we'd live to see your body without you inside it.
So that comes from later in the book when you've got Esme telling B about Phoebe. I believe that's from that bit.
Yes, that's right.
So we have B, the third child, and so she is a baby in the first part of the book, and then she kind of comes into her own as time goes on. Can you talk about her role in the book and this dynamic of her being so much a part of the second half of the novel?
Yeah, I was kind of interested, as I'd already said, playing around with if you lost your sister, and I was also interested in if you had lost a sister that you'd never known and how that would make you feel if you're kind of locked out of part of the history of your family. I mean, obviously, all younger children, there's parts of the family history that they weren't there for. But if something so significant had happened in your family and somebody had actually been lost and then you were born afterwards, I wondered how that would impact on you, because you wouldn't have the grief, but you would, well, I guess in a way you would have the grief because you would be so aware of the sense of loss within your family. And also, it was a kind of a double thing because I was interested in that, but I was also interested in Linda, the grieving mother, being pregnant at the time of her kind of full-on grief. So I wondered how you would feel if you lost a child and you were pregnant with another child at the same time. So B kind of fulfilled both of those. I could explore both of those things with her. And then, yeah, the second part of the novel is B's, really, as far as I'm concerned, because it's about her. I guess it's okay to say that it's about, she's pregnant in the second half, and so it's about a new person potentially coming into the family and how that kind of brings them all back to each other in a way and brings a bit of much needed hope into the family. So again, I liked the fact that B was a baby in the first half, and in the second half she's having a baby. So yeah, I feel like the second half of the novel belongs to B, but it was B that we had to do the most work on in the editing. because I think she was falling a bit flat, and I was really pleased with how she came to life when we started working on her.
That's interesting to hear, definitely. She does come to life, so it's done very, very well. But yeah, she's such a big part. I would not have guessed that at all. So the chapters specify days after, and days after everything's changed, what's happened and the death. Did you ever consider like altering it at the end, because it continues as days after, even after all these revelations have come out? Yes.
I think to me it was just a way of reminding the reader that whether it's 5 days after or 100 days after or several thousand days after, something like that in a family will still be having its impact, and just to kind of bring it home. Like, I wanted the numbers to be really big. I wanted it to be in days rather than months or years after. But I could have, in the second half, just said how many years after it was. But I just liked the fact that the numbers were big, and it was a reminder this is such a long time ago now, but it's still at the forefront of these people's minds. And even B, who wasn't alive when it happened, it's still having its ripple effect and its knock-on effects on her life. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, yes, in terms of the literary element and how you've communicated it, it's wonderful. It's not, it's a very damning sort of situation, obviously, but yes, it does have that effect for the reader as well, I suppose, is what I want to say.
I had a moment of panic just before the book was about to go to press, because I'd worked out the days and like how many days it should be all through the book, but I wanted to make sure somebody else had checked that, and I sent a panicked email to my publisher, and Sam, who had initially found the book, had diligently gone through and double checked, which I should have known, because they're really, really careful and they don't let anything slip through. But it was just nice to know that it wasn't only me who'd counted those days and how many it should add up to.
So a similar sort of theme for this next question. You've got the seasons of the two time frames. They sort of match each other almost. And I found it particularly poignant that the end of the book, it's sort of the same season as the beginning. Was this part of your plan as well?
No, it wasn't. I could lie and say, yeah. But no, that wasn't in the plan. And I have had readers come to me with a few other things that I can't say because it's a bit of a spoiler with the story and what actually had happened to Phoebe, but said, I thought it was really poignant how you did this. And I've said to them, that wasn't actually intentional. But this is what I love about how once you let a novel go, it belongs to the reader, and the reader, notices things that you may not have even intended. And that's the wonderful thing about the relationship between author and reader, I think, isn't it? The author has to let it go out into the world. It's not their work anymore, and then the reader gets to bring all their experiences to it and make their judgments and all of that. And I think that's just an amazing process. So no, I didn't intend to do that, but I'm really glad that it that it worked.
No, I totally agree with you. I think the book is a conversation in many ways.
Yeah.
And by having this conversation and new readers all the time reading it, obviously you're keeping the book alive as well, effectively. People are going to read this and they might be in a similar situation. Is there any way you would recommend for people to go?
Oh, that's really tough, because unlike I Wanted You to Know, Missing Pieces is all completely imagined. It's quite clear from the start of the book that Linda's in a very bad place and really struggling. And some people have said to me, did you intend that Linda had postnatal depression? And I said, no, I didn't intend that. To me, she was just grieving, but she may well have had that as well. So I guess loss is the main thing, isn't it? So I know there's a great charity called Cruise that offer bereavement counselling. And several people have said to me they just wanted to say somebody needs to get her some help when they were reading the book, which is great, because if people tell you something like that, then it's so real to them, because they actually want the character to get the help they need. But yeah, anybody who was reading it who could identify because of their own experiences, I would just encourage them to get the help, because nobody in that book really gets the help they need, apart from Esme in the second half is having counselling, but there needs to be a lot more counselling in that family as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I know, it takes place in the 1980s to begin with, and you think, well, okay, so there's some sort of historical aspect, the past, and maybe we didn't do as well then, but we could definitely do better still. So,
yes.
Yeah. I've left it to the end because it's not as important, but I loved that this book was set in Southampton. I could imagine the walk that they were going on to the common. Why Southampton, I have to ask?
I went to university in Southampton, and I lived
Ah,
there for the 3 years I was at university, and then I lived there for about 3 years afterwards. And whenever I start a book, I decide where to set it, and I basically set it somewhere that I have lived, because I'm not great on doing research. I'd rather just imagine. So I always set my books in a time period that I've lived in, and in a place that I know fairly well. So yeah, when I was first writing about those characters and I was doing that MA in Chichester, I was living in Southampton then. So I guess it just was a natural place to put it. But I know what you mean. If I pick up a book and I know the place, it's kind of like an instant connection.
I have to say, obviously I'm biased. Southampton's my hometown. But it's a place where people have always come to leave, or they come here to arrive in the country. We're on the map.
That's true, yeah.
So, I mean, we better move on to Nobody's Wife. I have deliberately got less questions because I knew that there would be more to speak about with Missing Pieces, and I wanted you to know. Shall we start with the reading?
Yeah, the reading is from a few chapters in. So basically the novel's about two couples, and it starts with Emily getting married to Michael, and then the other couple is Emily's sister Josephine and her new boyfriend Jack. And the bit I'm going to read is when the four of them all come together for the first time. When Jack met Emily, a memory flashed up unbidden. He was sure that on one of those grey school days he'd been asked to draw a picture of someone in his family, and discarding his mother and father, he'd made someone up. A girl woman, half comforting, half sexual, although he hadn't known that at the time. Tumbling red curls like Botticelli's Venus, freckles and angles and curves. And now, all these years later, she was standing there in front of him, a smile playing at the corner of her lips, as though he had sketched her into life. They had gone over for dinner, Jack and Josephine, and Emily ushered them into the warm house, pulling her sister close and kissing Jack's cheek, her movements quick and sure. Jack had been expecting a dull evening, a duty, not this. He felt overly aware of his body. He didn't know where to put his hands. The three of them went into the living room where Michael was sitting. "You must be Jack," Michael said, standing and reaching out his hand. Jack felt as though his reaction to Michael's wife was clear to see on his face. He shook Michael's hand, feeling fraudulent. Michael was older, Jack noticed, older than himself and Josephine, and older than Emily. His dark hair was sprinkled with grey, and there were creases around his eyes that gave him more credibility than Jack afforded himself. He also looked a little familiar, but Jack was fairly sure they hadn't met. Perhaps Michael had been a customer in the bookshop. "We've been looking forward to meeting you," Michael said, and Jack realised that he still hadn't spoken. "Thanks for having us over," he said, feeling like a child at the end of a party. When Emily stood and left the room, Jack had to stop himself from following her. But seconds later she was back, a bottle of wine in one hand and 4 glasses held by their stems in the other. "I hope you like red," she said, looking at him, her face a question mark. "Very much." Emily set the glasses down on the coffee table and Jack watched her pour the drinks. She kept pushing back her hair, and half of him wanted her to tie it back, and half of him didn't. When they each had a glass in their hand, Josephine asked what they were drinking to, and Jack turned to her, almost surprised that she was still there. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. There he was, just starting to feel good about this new relationship, just starting to believe that he was ready, and now Josephine had brought him here to meet her sister, and just like that he was lost again. "To us," Emily said, looking at each of them in turn, including them in her toast. "To us," the three of them chorused. Jack swilled his wine in the glass and took a long drink, hoping it would steady him, knowing it would do the opposite. Jack had been surprised when Josephine asked if he would come with her to this dinner. It seemed too soon. How long would he have to be with someone before he took them to meet his mother? It had never come up. He hoped that Josephine wouldn't expect it. Before dinner, Jack ventured upstairs to use the bathroom. He needed a few moments away from the situation to catch his breath, steady his nerves. But when he got upstairs, he couldn't remember whether Josephine had told him to take the first or the second door he came to. He opened the first, peered into the darkness, and saw at once that it was their bedroom. Jack turned on the light and surveyed the room. The bed was large and unmade, and he couldn't help but imagine them in it, naked and kissing, or curled up together in sleep, or reading the paper and drinking coffee on a Sunday morning. A man's t-shirt lay on the left pillow, almost certainly his, Jack thought, but which of them wore it? He thought of her wearing it, imagined the way it would ride up when she stretched and yawned. He felt a sharp stab of pain. What was happening here? Jack backed out of the room, trying to erase it from his memory, knowing that he would see it when he closed his eyes to sleep that night. The house wasn't the sort of place that people he knew lived in. Everyone he knew lived in a flat, mostly shared, and barely any of them had bought one. And it was beautiful too, large and high-ceilinged and bright. He wanted to know how Emily and Michael had this. He felt like he'd stepped into a different city, a different life. This was the sort of Friday night he could imagine in his future. 2 couples having dinner, maybe a couple of kids sleeping upstairs, wine and food and conversation. But not now, at 30. If it wasn't for Emily, he would be ready to flee.
What came first, the characters or the plot?
So the kind of germ of the idea for this novel came from a Leonard Cohen song called Famous Blue Raincoat. The song is a letter from a man to another man about a woman who they have both loved, and I wanted to write something based on that, and then, about a kind of love triangle. And then I came up with the idea of having the 2 sisters and how that would kind of add an extra dimension to the love triangle aspect. And so I guess the situation came first, and then I kind of built the characters around it.
And you start the book, we won't talk about it too much because going in depth is a spoiler, but the start of the book does say that there's effectively 3.
Yes.
Was this always in the plan? There's this idea that you'll start with 3 and something might happen. It might not, but was that always in your mind?
I quite like a prologue that kind of hints at something that you then have to read the rest of the novel to fully understand. So yeah, I liked the idea of starting it with something that may or may not be a funeral, and that only 3 of these 4 are there, and the reader having to kind of guess who's not there and why.
I looked at other reviews and got an idea for what people thought of characters. I know that everybody loves Michael. Do you have a favourite character in this book? Or do you have a character you really don't like, I suppose, also?
I don't like Jack. But, I mean, he was brilliant to write because he's just like every messed up man. I think a lot of people have a Jack in their past who has kind of messed them around. And I quite like Emily, and a lot of people hate her. But like when you're writing from each character's perspective, because it's all written in third person, but it kind of jumps around. So that bit I read was obviously from Jack's perspective, but you see it from all 4 of their perspectives, and you have to kind of get inside their skin. And so you can't really hate any of them. You have to have some kind of empathy with all of them, I think, to make it work. And so, I mean, Michael and Josephine are both complete innocents, and, they don't deserve what happens to them. And I don't think they weren't as fun to write as Emily and Jack. They were the fun ones. And yeah, Emily's very confused and makes some really bad decisions, but I quite liked her as well.
It's kind of nice to hear that it was quite fun to write in a way, because I mean, it's not that it's not fun to read by any stretch, but again, it's kind of, you've got this twisting here and stuff like that. So yeah, that's interesting. We are going to move on to I Wanted You to Know, readers. I think, should we start with the reading, because this is quite a different book?
Yes, let's. So the reading for this one is a letter from me to readers. So it's not actually part of the book, but it explains a bit about why I wrote the book, and then I think it will lead nicely into the discussion we're going to have, I guess. Dear reader, when I was 35 and 5 months pregnant with my second child, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. No one expects to have to face cancer at that age. No one expects their body to turn on them just when they are busy creating new life. I waited with my heart in my mouth to be told I was going to have to terminate. Instead, I was told I could be operated on during my pregnancy and start chemotherapy after the birth. The first question I asked after diagnosis was whether I'd be able to breastfeed my daughter. I didn't ask whether I was going to die. Perhaps I wasn't ready to, but I always put it down to the fact that when you're carrying a child, your instinct is to put that child first. I felt like I had to bring her into the world safely, no matter what. And with the help of the incredible NHS, I did. When my daughter was 7 days old and miles away from home in a special care unit after an incredibly shaky start, I had the first of 6 rounds of chemo. I'd held her perhaps twice at that point. She hadn't been home. I wasn't able to be any sort of a mother. I followed all the instructions I was given. Lie still while we surgically insert this port for administering the chemo drugs. Take this medication. Call us if your symptoms are worrying you. And in the back of my mind, I wondered whether I would survive it, whether I would get to be her mother at all. My son was 2.5. We were still counting my daughter's age in days. If I died, neither of them would remember me. It seems so impossible that, when you've been a mother for more than 2 years, and all those hundreds of days have been spent taking care of your child, when you have fed him from your body and sung him to sleep, when you have held him so often, you can feel the warmth and weight of his body even when he isn't there. But I knew that he would forget me if I died, and she would never know me, and I wondered what I could leave them, what they would need if they didn't have a mother. When my treatment was over, I set myself the challenge of writing a 50,000-word first draft of a novel in the month of November. It wasn't easy. My daughter was home by then, and both my children needed me. I was tired from the chemo, and I had a small operation during that month, and another big one ahead of me. But I'm stubborn, and I don't always take the easy road, and this was one of those times. Day after day, I added 2,000 words to my document, this book that I was calling I Wanted You to Know. It was written in letters. It was about my fears, and it poured out of me, and every day I felt a little lighter for getting it out of my head and onto the page. Of that initial draft, not much remains. The title, the characters of Jess, Jake, Gemma, and Edie, the disease that Jess and I share. I've rewritten it a couple of times. It was elusive, it was hard, but in the early months of 2019, I rewrote it from scratch and something clicked. It poured out again, and this time it was right. One of the best things about writing novels is how they can surprise you. I planned this novel out chapter by chapter, and though I didn't deviate from that plan, it became something I hadn't expected it to. I thought it was a love story, and it is in part, but I didn't know that it would be a love letter to friendship, to women, to life, that it would be a celebration as well as a tale of loss, that it would champion the wisdom of ordinary women, their compassion, their incredible strength in the face of tragedy. The book you hold in your hands is the story of Jess and the people who matter to her. It's about fear and virtue and bravery and love. I hope it strikes a chord with you. I hope it makes you want to reach out to those you love and pull them a little closer. Thank you for reading. Laura.
Was there a lot of difference between the final book and the start? Where did it kind of flow for you and work, I suppose?
So the first draft that was written in that single month was very different from the final book. So it was in 2 parts, and the first part was all letters from Jess to her baby daughter, Edie. And then the second part was set 20 years later, and it was letters from a newly adult Edie, she was about 19, to her mother who had died. And my editor really liked the first half, the letters, but didn't think the second half was working. So I rewrote the second half, but I still had this element with an adult Edie. And so I wrote a kind of narrative rather than letters for the second half of a grown-up Edie kind of trying to grapple with becoming an adult without having had a mum to kind of guide her through life, and what the letters that her mum left for her meant to her and how they had informed her through life. And it still wasn't working, so I just rewrote the whole thing. And as it stands now, it has some letters from Jess to her daughter, but most of it is narrative. And that's when all these other elements came in to play, like the relationship between Jess and her mum, and Jess and her best friend Gemma. And that relationship between Jess and her best friend is actually my favourite part of the book, I think. So I thought it was a book about loss and about mothers and daughters, but what came out of it was this. I mean, all the characters, or almost all the characters, are women. So it's Jess, who's the one who has cancer, and her daughter, who's just a baby, but also her mother, and then her best friend. And it is about Edie's father as well, but mostly it's about these strong women and how they cope with this horrendous situation of a cancer diagnosis at 21 years old. So yeah, it really went through quite significant changes. And someday I'd quite like to revisit grown-up Edie, because I was a bit sad that she didn't make it into the book in the end. But I think all authors would tell you that you write reams and reams of stuff that doesn't make it into the book, and sometimes you're sad that it hasn't made it into the book, but the book just it can only be, it can't be everything. So maybe I'll have to go back to Edie at some point in the future.
Well, it's obviously a different situation, but it's kind of like when you've got Esme, Edie, the non-verbal baby at the moment. She is a massive character in herself. So yeah, it's kind of not a surprise, I suppose, that bit was, you did write more for that and you developed Edie as an adult. You've talked about Jess's mum and Gemma, and I mean, one of the nice things, the uplifting, I suppose, elements is this friendship with Gemma. And Gemma shows a particular type of support that Jess's mum is lacking. When I was thinking of Jess's mum, I was also thinking of maybe you further back in your other books, you've kind of got these missing mothers. Was there an additional reason for Jess's mum to be as she is?
I think I just wanted to explore a realistic view of what happens when you have cancer, because I've had cancer myself and I'm in a lot of support groups. I've talked to a lot of other women who've had cancer, and it's very, very common for somebody very close to you to not really cope very well, and either to disappear from your life or just not be very supportive or not give you the support you needed. So I felt like in the book I needed Jess to have that support. So it was Gemma gave her exactly the kind of support she wanted, and for her mum it was much more complicated, which I think potentially makes sense, because if your child is going through something like this, I think that's an incredibly hard thing to deal with as a mother. I think most mothers would rather go through something themselves than see their child go through it. So yeah, I didn't want it to be that she had cancer and everybody did exactly the right thing and knew exactly what to do and what to say, because that isn't how it is in real life. There's people who shy away from talking about it, or who don't know what to say to you, or who just do the wrong thing, because everybody's fallible and everybody's terrified of things like cancer and nobody really knows the best thing to do. So yeah, I just wanted some different reactions, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. So you've introduced us with your letter at the start, and you've had breast cancer yourself, and you've had your operations and everything. And if it's okay to ask, you've got Jess, and I'm not going to consider worrying about spoilers with this podcast, because I don't think it's with this book. I don't think it's appropriate, really. You have Jess, and she's 21, and she's a new mother, and she has terminal cancer. Obviously, it must have been very difficult for you kind of writing this. What was your reason, I suppose I want to say, for writing something like that?
I think I wanted to write down all the things I was really scared of, like the worst case scenario, which would be that I would die and not be there to bring my children up. And when I was a child and if I was scared of something, I always thought if I imagined it, then it couldn't happen because it would be too much of a coincidence. If I imagined something in loads of detail, then that exact thing couldn't happen to me. And I'm talking about like being scared of monsters and like things under the bed. And so I guess it's a form of that. Like if you write something down, then what are the chances of that then happening to you? But I think it's just I needed to go there. I needed to go to like the darkest places and write about what would happen. And I also thought if I did die, then this book would be quite a nice thing for my children to have, because not when they were children, but when they were older. because it's like even though it's not my own story, but the way Jess talks about how she feels about her daughter, that was all how I feel about my children. So I just thought it would be quite a nice thing to leave behind if I were to die. But also there was this element of, well, if I write it down, then it can't happen, which is quite silly. But yeah, I think I just needed to explore it. I think everybody's very different. Some people can't read or write anything about, terminal cancer if they've had cancer because it's just too close to the bone. Whereas I've had people sometimes say to me, oh, this book, not my book, but a different book, they're like, oh, it has got cancer in it, and I'm like, I'm fine reading about cancer. I've written about cancer. So yeah, I don't kind of shy away from things like that. I'm happy to read about them and write about them. But there were times when it was hard to do as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, it's difficult enough to read, I think.
There's elements of the story that I had to do some research on because I've had cancer, but I haven't had secondary cancer, terminal cancer. So I knew what it was like to have chemo and I knew what it was like to lose your hair and things like that. But there are things I didn't know what it was like. But those I kind of projected and imagined because that's what you do when you're a writer. You have to just put yourself in somebody's shoes and imagine how you would feel in that position. So some of it's that and some of it is how I felt about particular things.
Would you recommend that other writers who are in difficult positions do the same? Write it out and write your scary thoughts?
It definitely works for me. Everybody's different, I think. My mum had breast cancer a few years before I had breast cancer. And then I remember being in a bookshop with her after she'd had her surgery. And I found a memoir written by somebody who'd had breast cancer. And I said, oh, look, this might be interesting to you. And she was like, that's the last thing I would want to read, because she just wanted to forget about cancer and put it behind her. And I'm a bit more, not so much dwell on things in an unhealthy way, but cancer is interesting to me now because I've experienced it and it's been a big part of my life. And so I am happy to read and write about that. And I've written over and over about my actual experience for various publications and blog posts and things like that. I'm trying to make something good come out of something awful. So like I'm trying to raise awareness and help charities and things like that. So yeah, I feel like I'm not going to pretend I haven't had cancer. So I might as well talk about it and write about it.
What did you want to, you said it's kind of cathartic for you and it was helpful and also you're getting all your thoughts down. What did you want to leave the reader thinking?
Well, a lot of people have told me that it's much more hopeful than they expected, because people kind of go into this book knowing that it's be really sad. And it's one of those that friends will say, oh, I've bought your book and I'm taking it on holiday with me. And I say, maybe don't read it on holiday because I don't want to ruin your holiday. It's really sad. So people know going into it what they're going to get. But some people have said that they were surprised by the uplifting elements of it and the hopeful elements of it. And I think there's something very hopeful about a new baby, isn't there? And so even though at the end that Edie is going to grow up without a mother, she's this new life, and there's this sense in it that she is going to kind of rescue everybody from their grief, because it's like, when I had cancer, I also still had to just carry on being a mum, and children, you can't wallow when you've got children around. You just have to get on with it, and they just kind of make you laugh and they don't understand anything that's going on. So they're brilliant to have around in difficult times because they just take you completely out of that. So yeah, I wanted there to be a message of hope, because obviously these awful things do happen, but I think all the characters are going to carry on and not necessarily be okay, but they're going to find a way through it with the help of Edie, I think.
Yeah. So you said that your next book is going to be quite happy.
That the book I mentioned earlier is actually my 5th book, because my 4th book is written. We're just doing the final edits on it, and then it's going out on submission because I have completed my 3-book deal with Agora. And then while I'm waiting for edits on that, I'm writing a 5th one because I can't ever be without a book on the go. So it's the 5th one that is much lighter. I said to my agent, I feel like I'm writing a rom-com. And she said, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, the 4th one It's a love story, but with a speculative element in the way of something like The Time Traveller's Wife. And then the fifth one is a sliding doors story. So it's about a couple and then it splits into two narratives. And in one, they have children, and in the other, they don't have children. And it's about the impact that has on the woman's life in particular.
I look forward to those, definitely.
Oh, thank you.
Very exciting. So, Missing Pieces, Nobody's Wife, and I Wanted You to Know are out now from Agora Books. And as always, links are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed this podcast, do subscribe for future episodes. Laura, it has been fantastic having you on the show and hearing about the background to your books. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. I love talking about my books.
Join me on Monday the 13th of April, when I will be talking to Weike Wang, first name spelt Weike, author of the novel Chemistry. The Wormhole Podcast episode 11 was recorded on the 29th of February and published on the 23rd of March 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.